Hello, welcome back to my channel, Close Reading with me, Dr. Octavia Cox, and today I want to look at some of the introductions between the heroes and the heroines in Jane Austen's novels. Particularly, I want to look at the lack of conversation between the heroine and hero in Persuasion, and I'm going to compare that especially with Pride and Prejudice and Emma. And I want to reveal how Persuasion is different from the other novels, and Austen's different aims for her novels through the way that she uses dialogue, or in Persuasion's case, the lack of it. Remember, if you like this video, do please subscribe and hit the thumbs up. So to give you a little bit of background then, nearly 8 years ago, Anne Elliot broke off her engagement with Captain Wentworth because of her family's disapproval. Now, Wentworth has returned to Anne's life, and no one else around knows of their previous engagement. It's a secret. Wentworth is handsome, he's now rich, he's a war hero, and all the ladies fancy him. He's very, very eligible. And this is the scene where they meet again after nearly 8 years. Mary, very much gratified by his attention, was delighted to receive him, while 1,000 feelings rushed on Anne, of which this was the most consoling: that it would soon be over. And it was soon over. In 2 minutes after Charles's preparation, the others had appeared. They were in the drawing-room. Her eye half met Captain Wentworth's. A bow, a curtsy passed. She heard his voice. He talked to Mary, said all that was right, said something to the Miss Musgroves, enough to mark an easy footing. The room seemed full of persons and voices, but a few minutes ended it. Charles showed himself at the window. All was ready. Their visitor had bowed and was gone. The Miss Musgroves were gone too, suddenly resolving to walk to the end of the village with the sportsmen. The room was cleared, and Anne might finish her breakfast as she could. It is over, she repeated to herself again and again in nervous gratitude. The worst is over. We're told her eye half met Captain Wentworth's, a bow, a curtsy passed, and that's it. That's all the interaction the two have. Their eyes half met. They don't even look at each other fully. Certainly they don't speak to each other. And indeed, readers are not even told what the general conversation actually even was. She heard his voice, he talked to Mary, said all that was right, said something to the Miss Musgroves, enough to mark an easy footing. Compare that to Pride and Prejudice, which is a novel that is all about dialogue. And in fact, meaning comes through and indeed from the very fact that much of the form of the novel is in dialogue. It's in large part about miscommunication, so we might think of Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, who are always talking to each other but don't understand each other. And even Mr. Collins, when he, for example, declares himself to Lizzie and proposes to her, and he misunderstands her refusal. It's also about deceptive communication. So in particular, the character of George Wickham, who Lizzie is initially deceived by. And dialogue remains important all the way through the novel, from the very opening chapter. So much of the first chapter is taken up with the dialogue between Mr. and Mrs. Bennet. There are many other ways that Austen could have set up the novel, but she chooses to have it through dialogue. And in another key scene in the novel, where Lady Catherine comes to Longbourn and her and Lizzie have a conversation in the wilderness, they have a kind of, Lizzie and Lady Catherine have a kind of verbal dueling, and Lizzie defeats Lady Catherine, and Lady Catherine has to kind of retreat with her tail between her legs. And Lizzie's and Darcy's relationship is characterised by their conversation. Even when they disagree, their compatibility is shown in the way that they exchange words and ideas with each other in conversation. So we might think, for example, of the ball at Netherfield, where they really kind of get to speak to each other properly for the first time. Or the conversation at Netherfield where Lizzie and Darcy are kind of conversing about ladies' accomplishments and Caroline Bingley can't even keep up with them. That their relationship is going to be characterised by miscommunication is clear from their very first encounter. So Darcy is with, he's talking to Mr. Bingley, and they spot Lizzie sitting down, not dancing. And Mr. Darcy says to Mr. Bingley, as Lizzie is listening, "Which do you mean?" And turning round, he looked for a moment at Elizabeth, till catching her eye, he withdrew his own. So he knows that she's listening. And coldly said, "She is tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me." But ultimately, as the novel progresses, Lizzie has to trust what Darcy says and learn the truth of what other people say about Darcy. So she has to see through the miscommunication, the deceptive communication of George Wickham, and then trust the conversation of a character like Mrs. Reynolds, who is Pemberley's housekeeper, who gives an absolutely kind of glowing recommendation about Darcy's true character. So Darcy and Lizzie move from miscommunication and they come to understand each other. Unlike Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, for example, who spend their entire married life communicating but not understanding each other. And in Emma, it's clear from the very opening chapter that conversational exchange, that back and forth, that to and fro, that yin and yang, is fundamental to Emma's and Knightley's relationship. So this is very early in chapter 1, when we're told she, Emma, dearly loved her father, but he was no companion for her. He could not meet her in conversation, rational or playful. So we know that conversation is going to play an important part as Emma's narrative begins. Mr. Woodhouse is no companion for her, so we know that a true companion of Emma's is going to have to meet her in conversation. Conversely, Emma's and Knightley's relationship, and again this is from the very opening chapter, is characterised by rational and playful conversation. So Emma says to Mr. Woodhouse, "Mr. Knightley loves to find fault with me, you know, in a joke. It is all a joke. We always say what we like to one another." And Mr. Woodhouse hasn't, true to form, hasn't understood the joke, hasn't understood the playful conversation. And the narrative voice tells us Mr. Knightley, in fact, was one of the few people who could see faults in Emma Woodhouse, and the only one who ever told her of them. So Emma is a novel all about finding meaning beyond what's being said, and a lot of conversation happens, so Miss Bates, for example, but the reader is supposed to work out what's going on beyond the surface trivial conversation, and the same applies for Emma as well. She has rational and playful conversation with Mr. Knightley, but she has to kind of take that from outside of Hartfield, outside of the home, and into the world. So a key scene in Emma, for example, is the scene at Box Hill, where Emma crucially says something wrong. She says something rude to Miss Bates. Now, Persuasion is an absolutely beautiful, tender novel, but it's a very curious love story in a way, because the heroine and the hero virtually never speak to each other. And this is completely unlike Pride and Prejudice and Emma. Those are novels which are characterised by the ways in which the heroine and the hero talk to one another. So A key scene in Persuasion is when Wentworth silently overhears a conversation between Anne and Captain Harville, in which Anne argues that women love longest when all hope is gone. So it is Wentworth hearing Anne's conversation with somebody else that prompts him into realizing his love for her. And this leads me to another interesting climactic difference between the three novels. So in Pride and Prejudice and Emma, in the declaration proposal scene, the hero and heroine reveal their feelings to each other out loud. They actually speak to each other. But in Persuasion, they don't speak to each other. They're not even in the same room. Wentworth writes Anne a letter, which Anne then reads alone. And significantly, Wentworth writes in the letter, "A look, a word will be enough." They then meet on the street, but Charles Musgrove is there too, so they're not alone. The narrative voice reads, "They were on Union Street," and I love the kind of geographic symbolism there from Austen. They were on Union Street when a quicker step behind, something of familiar sound, gave her 2 moments preparation. And we might remember that this is echoing back to the reintroduction scene that I read earlier, where Anne has this kind of very brief moment, we're told, of preparation for Wentworth appearing. So she hears this quicker step that gives her 2 moments preparation for the sight of Captain Wentworth. He joined them, but as if irresolute whether to join or to pass on, said nothing, only looked. Anne could command herself enough to receive that look, and not repulsively. The cheeks which had been pale now glowed, and the movements which had hesitated were decided. He walked by her side. And that's it. There's absolutely no conversation between them at all. He looks at her and she looks back at him. And just as a side note, I do realise that in these illustrations, all the heroes look completely identical, but just so that you know, the very bottom one is Pride and Prejudice, the one on the left is Emma, and then the two more centrally are Persuasion. So going back to their reintroduction scene, the important point here is the "while 1,000 feelings rushed on Anne." So while all the other external stuff is going on, while Mary is being gratified and Henrietta and Louisa are flirting with Wentworth, etc., meanwhile, while all of that is going on, Anne is experiencing 1,000 feelings. And readers aren't told what those feelings are. We're left to imagine those for ourselves. But the way the text is formulated prompts us to imagine Anne's feelings, not what the conversation actually was. I mean, basically, that's completely irrelevant to what's important in this scene. And I think the symbolism of the final sentence is important. "It is over, it is over," she repeated to herself again and again in nervous gratitude. The worst is over. So we're not told the external conversation, we're told Anne's internal conversation that she has with herself. And this final telling of Anne's feelings to herself echoes her kind of earlier thoughts before she actually meets Wentworth, and this kind of beautiful structure here by Austen. So before she actually meets Wentworth again, her thinking to herself, and this is her most consoling thought, is that it would soon be over, and it was soon over. It's a kind of beautiful compression of time that really echoes what it feels like when you're building up to a moment, when you're thinking about a moment and you think, oh, it's coming, it's coming, it's coming, it will soon be here, it will soon be here, it will soon be here, and then it's gone. And that sense is reiterated in Anne's repetitions to herself later that we see kind of Anne telling herself, and we're reminded that these words were how she had consoled herself before. And again, she's using exactly the same words to console herself after this sort of half meeting, this half eye look with no conversation with Wentworth. So I've shown today that Persuasion is a very different kind of novel from Pride and Prejudice and Emma. It's all about Anne's interiority. This is not a heroine who's going out into the world and negotiating with that world in a kind of typical Bildungsroman kind of a way. It's about Anne's reconciling herself to her own past, dealing with her own internal conflict rather than any external conflict with the world. I hope you've enjoyed this comparison of dialogue or not between Persuasion and Pride and Prejudice and Emma. Do please subscribe and hit the thumbs up. And check out my other videos and comment down below suggesting any other Austen moments that you'd like to take a closer look at.